The ballroom was filled with the kind of noise that only power and money could produce: low laughter, the soft clink of glasses, and conversations spoken just loudly enough to be overheard by the right people. Chandeliers hung like frozen suns above polished marble floors, casting a warm golden glow over tuxedos, evening gowns, and faces trained to smile even when they felt nothing at all. It was an industry dinner, one of those nights where egos were fed more than stomachs, where deals were hinted at with raised eyebrows and futures were decided in passing remarks. On paper, it was a celebration of cinema. In truth, it was a test of hierarchy. A place where everyone silently measured their worth against the room. Sammy stood near the edge of the gathering, holding his drink loosely, his posture relaxed but alert. He had learned long ago that rooms like this demanded awareness, not anxiety. His smile came easily, not because he was pretending, but because he refused to let spaces like this steal his joy. He had worked too hard, endured too much, and survived too many closed doors to let a room full of polished strangers make him feel small. Yet even with his success, even with the applause that followed him wherever he went, there were moments, quiet, sharp moments, when he could feel the weight of being watched differently across the room. Dean leaned against a column, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass he had barely touched. His eyes moved slowly, not in boredom, but in observation. Dean had always been like that, calm on the surface, attentive beneath it. He noticed things others missed: a forced laugh, a clenched jaw, a silence that arrived too quickly. Tonight, his attention kept drifting back to Sammy, not out of concern, but out of instinct. Years of friendship had trained him to read the room not just for himself, but for the people he cared about. The director arrived late, as powerful men often did, making sure the room noticed him without saying a word. Conversations shifted as he passed, heads turning, smiles adjusting, bodies angling subtly in his direction. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed the world owed him attention, and who had been proven right often enough to believe it permanently. When he spotted Sammy, something unreadable crossed his face, flicker of recognition mixed with something colder. He approached with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Glass raised in mocked camaraderie. The surrounding conversation softened, people instinctively sensing that something was about to happen. The director spoke loudly enough for those nearby to hear, his tone casual, almost playful, but sharpened by an edge that couldn't be mistaken. He made a remark when framed as a joke, coated in false charm that questioned Sammy's place in the room, his presence at the event, and subtly, cruelly, his worth. The laughter that followed was thin and scattered, more reflex than amusement. Some people smiled out of fear, others out of habit, and a few looked away altogether, suddenly fascinated by the floor or their drinks. The insult hung in the air, heavier than the music, heavier than the chandeliers above. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't violent, but it was precise, deliberate, and meant to wound without leaving a mark. Sammy felt it land, not like a punch, but like a familiar pressure he had carried most of his life. For a brief moment, memories, sturdily auditions, back doors, polite rejections, dressed up as compliments. The room seemed to narrow, sound fading at the edges. He could have responded. He had the wit, the timing, the skill to turn the moment around. But he also knew that some moments were designed to trap you no matter what you said. So he did something unexpected. He smiled. Not a performative smile, not a defensive one. A calm, dignified smile that said more than any sharp reply ever could. He met the director's eyes steadily, unflinching, and simply nodded, as if acknowledging a comment that wasn't worth correcting. In that quiet response, there was strength and unspoken refusal to be diminished. Dean saw it all. He didn't move right away. He didn't rush in or raise his voice or draw attention to himself. Instead, he took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze fixed on the director now, assessing him the way a seasoned card player studies an opponent. Dean understood something that many people in that room did not. Power didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waited. The director, emboldened by the lack of confrontation, added another remarklighter in tone, heavier in implication. This time, the silence was deeper. Even the band seemed to falter, a brief pause in the music as if the room itself was holding its breath. Sammy's smile remained, but his eyes darkened slightly, not with anger, but with resolve. That was when Dean stepped forward. He didn't stride. He didn't hurry. He walked with the ease of someone who belonged anywhere he chose to stand. His presence alone shifted the atmosphere like a change in weather. Conversations nearby stopped altogether now, not out of curiosity, but out of instinct. People recognized that something meaningful was unfolding, something they would remember long after the night ended. Dean positioned himself beside Sammy. Not in front of him, not behind him, but exactly beside him, shoulder to shoulder. It was a quiet gesture, subtle enough to miss if you weren't paying attention, powerful enough to be unmistakable if you were. He turned to the director with a relaxed expression, his voice low, steady, and almost friendly. He didn't insult him. He didn't accuse him. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he spoke with the calm certainty of someone stating a fact, reminding the room without spectacle, without cruelty, of who Sammy was, of what he had achieved, and of the respect he deserved. His words were measured, deliberate, impossible to argue with without revealing something ugly about oneself. The director laughed awkwardly, attempting to deflect, but the momentum had shifted. The room was no longer on his side. People who had smiled moments earlier now watched with quiet admiration. Some nodded almost imperceptibly. Others straightened, as if reminded of something they had nearly forgotten. Sammy felt something loosen in his chest, not pride. It's not triumph, but gratitude. Not because Dean had defended him, but because Dean had done so without turning the moment into a spectacle. Without speaking over him, without implying he needed saving. It was solidarity. It was pure and simple. The director muttered something about miscommunication and excused himself soon after. His authority diminished not by confrontation, but by clarity. As he walked away, the room slowly came back to life, though it was different now, softer, more aware. Dean turned to Sammy then, his expression easy again, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. He made a light comment about the music, about how they should probably leave before someone else embarrassed themselves. Sammy laughed a real laugh this time and nodded, as they walked away together side by side. It was clear to anyone watching that what had just occurred wasn't about ego or dominance. It was about respect, about knowing when to speak and when silence carried more power than noise, about standing beside someone not because it looks good, but because it's right. And though the night would end, and the chandeliers would dim, and the room would eventually forget the details, one truth lingered quietly in the air long after they were gone. Kindness, when paired with courage, had a way of changing rooms and people forever. The night did not end when the doors of the ballroom closed behind them. For Sammy, the echoes of the evening lingered long after the music faded, settling into the quiet spaces where thoughts grew heavier. The city outside was alive, lights stretching endlessly, traffic humming like a distant ocean. But inside the car, there was a calm silence that felt earned rather than awkward. Sammy leaned back in his seat, watching reflections of streetlights glide across the window, his mind replaying the moment not with bitterness, but with a strange clarity. He had faced insults before, far harsher than the one delivered that night. Yet something about this encounter stayed with him, not because of the cruelty itself, but because of the restraint it demanded. Dean drove without hurry, one hand resting casually on the wheel, his expression unreadable but thoughtful. He had always understood silence as a language of its own, one that didn't rush to explain itself. Years in the industry had taught him that words were often overused, especially by those who feared losing control. Tonight, however, silence had done something different. It had exposed character. Not the polished kind people displayed when cameras were rolling, but the deeper kind that revealed itself only under pressure. Sammy finally spoke. His voice calm, measured, carrying neither anger nor regret. He thanked Dean, not dramatically, not emotionally, but sincerely. It wasn't gratitude for protection. It was appreciation for understanding. Dean nodded once, keeping his eyes on the road, and replied in the same understated tone that had defined his actions earlier. He said that no one should ever feel alone in a room full of people, especially not someone who had earned their place 1,000 times over. The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any speech ever could. Over the following days, the story of that night spread quietly, not through headlines or gossip columns, but through conversations whispered between agents, performers, and producers who had been there or had heard from someone who was. What struck people wasn't confrontation or drama. It was the absence of it. The director's words had been sharp, but Dean's response, measured, calm. Undeniable had become the real point of discussion. People began to talk less about what was said and more about what it meant. In an industry built on loud personalities and louder egos, restraint had left a deeper impression than outrage ever could. Sammy noticed a shift almost immediately. Meetings felt different. Conversations lingered longer. Eyes met his with a new level of respect, not pity, not admiration, but recognition. It was as if something unspoken had finally been acknowledged, not just about him, but about the way people like him were expected to navigate spaces that celebrated talent while quietly testing endurance. He carried himself the same way he always had, refusing to let validation change him. Yet aware that moments like these subtly reshaped the landscape, Dean, meanwhile, remained unchanged on the surface. Still joking with friends, still arriving late to rehearsals, still brushing off compliments with ease. But privately, he reflected on the moment more than he let on. He had seen too many talented people shrink themselves to survive, too many voices softened out of fear, too many injustices dismissed as just the way things are. That night had reminded him that influence carried responsibility, not the kind that demanded speeches or grand gestures, but the kind that required presence at the right moment and restraint when reaction would have been easier. The director did not apologize publicly. There were no statements, no clarifications issued to the press. Instead, his absence from future gatherings spoke louder than any explanation. Invitations slowed. Conversations cooled. Not because he had insulted someone, but because he had revealed something about himself that others quietly took note of. The industry had a way of correcting itself when faced with undeniable truth, and this was one of those moments. No one needed to be punished. They simply needed to be seen clearly. One evening, weeks later, Sammy stood backstage before a performance, adjusting his cufflinks as the muffled sound of the audience filled the space beyond the curtain. He felt a familiar rush anticipation mixed with gratitude, but also something new, a steadiness that came from knowing he no longer needed to brace himself in the same way. He wasn't naive enough to believe that one moment had changed everything, but he understood that it had shifted something important. It had reminded him that dignity was not something granted by others. It was something claimed, protected, and sometimes shared. Dean watched from the wings that night, arms crossed loosely, a quiet smile forming as Sammy took the stage to thunderous applause. He didn't clap immediately. He waited, listening, observing the way the audience leaned forward, drawn in by presence rather than performance alone. In that moment, Dean felt a rare sense of certainty, not pride, not ownership, but affirmation. The kind that comes from knowing you did the right thing without needing credit for it. As the lights dimmed and the music swelled, Sammy began to sing, his voice carrying emotion shaped by experience rather than hardship alone. Every note held resilience. Every pause carried intention. The audience didn't know the full story behind the performance, but they felt its truth all the same. That was the power of quiet courage. It didn't demand understanding to be effective. And somewhere in the space between the stage lights and the shadows behind the curtain, a lesson settled deeply, not just for them, but for anyone paying attention. Real strength didn't shout, real loyalty didn't perform, and real change often began with a single calm voice choosing respect over reaction. Time has a way of revealing which moments were fleeting and which were foundational. Weeks passed, then months, and what happened that night did not fade as so many industry stories did. Instead, it settled into conversations with weight, surfacing unexpectedly in rehearsal rooms, offices, in late-night discussions where honesty felt safer than performance. People spoke about it not as an incident, but as an example, a reference point for how things could be handled when ego stepped aside and integrity took the lead. It was never framed dramatically. There were no exaggerated retellings, no embellishments. The power of the moment came from its restraint, and that restraint gave it longevity. Sammy felt the shift most clearly in the way younger performers approached him now. They didn't ask about awards or fame. They asked about endurance, about dignity, about how to remain whole in an industry that often asked people to fracture themselves to survive. He listened more than he spoke, understanding that guidance didn't always require instruction. Sometimes, simply standing as proof that resilience could coexist with grace was enough. He shared stories selectively, not to relive old wounds, but to show that strength wasn't forged in confrontation alone, but in choosing when not to respond at all. There were moments, however, when the weight of it all pressed in unexpectedly. Late nights in quiet hotel rooms, Sammy would sit alone, replaying the director's words not with pain, but with curiosity. He asked himself why some people needed to diminish others to feel secure, and why kindness still felt radical in spaces built on competition. The answers never arrived fully formed, but the questions themselves softened him rather than hardened him. He realized that the insult had revealed more about the speaker than the target, and that understanding freed him from carrying something that was never his to begin with. Dean, on the other hand, experienced the aftermath differently. His actions had not been calculated, but their impact forced him to confront the reach of his influence. People began referencing his response as if it were intentional strategy, as if he had planned to make a statement. Dean corrected no one. He knew that explaining would cheapen the truth. What mattered wasn't intention, but outcome, and the outcome had been clarity. He became more aware of how often silence was misused as indifference, when in reality, it could be a form of protection if wielded with care. At a private gathering months later, Dean found himself approached by a producer who spoke cautiously, choosing words as if navigating a narrow bridge. The man admitted that he had once laughed at jokes he didn't agree with, stayed quiet when someone was belittled, and justified it as survival. He said that witnessing what Dean had done without anger, without spectacle, had forced him to reconsider his own silence. It wasn't a confession, not quite, but it was an acknowledgement. And Dean recognized it for what it was, a beginning. The industry did not transform overnight. There were still rooms filled with hierarchy, still moments when power was misused, still voices drowned out by louder ones. But something subtle had changed. A pause now existed where none had before. People hesitated before speaking thoughtlessly. They glanced around the room, gauging not who held the most authority, but who carried the most integrity. It wasn't a revolution. It was a recair. Sammy experienced the clearest proof of this shift during a negotiation for a new project. In the past, he would have been subtly reminded of his replaceability, his value framed as conditional. This time, the conversation unfolded differently. His input was sought, his boundaries respected, his presence treated as essential rather than optional. No one mentioned the past. No one needed to. Respect, once normalized, required no explanation. Yet the most powerful moment came not in public, but in private. During a quiet evening shared between friends, Sammy and Dean sat together, laughter punctuating long stretches of comfortable silence. At one point, Sammy admitted something he had never said aloud before, that the hardest part of moments like that night wasn't the insult itself, but the expectation to respond in a way that made others comfortable. He spoke of the exhaustion that came from constantly deciding which battles were worth fighting and which costs were too high. Dean listened without interruption, understanding that sometimes presence was the only appropriate response. Dean replied simply, saying that courage wasn't about confrontation, and it wasn't about endurance either. It was about alignment, about choosing actions that matched your values even when doing nothing would have been easier. He told Sammy that the room had changed that night not because someone was corrected, but because someone was seen and stood beside, without condition. As the night wore on, both men understood something profound. Their story wasn't about triumph over cruelty or public vindication. It was about modeling a different way of being, one that didn't rely on dominance or humiliation to assert worth. It was about the quiet confidence that came from knowing who you are and refusing to let others define it for you, and far beyond that single room. Beyond that single insult, the lesson continued to ripple outward, carried not by headlines or applause, but by choices small, deliberate. Human choices made by people who had witnessed what real power looked like when it didn't need to announce itself. Years have a way of compressing moments into meaning. What once felt like a single evening in a glittering room gradually transformed into something far larger. Not because it was retold endlessly, but because it was remembered accurately. The night when dignity stood its ground without raising its voice became less about who said what and more about what followed afterward. The applause, the stages, the accolades all continued, but beneath them ran a deeper current one, shaped by choices that were made quietly and carried forward. Deliberately, Sammy reached a point in his life where reflection came as naturally as performance once had. He found himself thinking less about the obstacles he had overcome and more about the standards he had helped set, often without realizing it at the time. Invitations still came. Stages still welcomed him. But what moved him most were the letters and conversations that arrived unexpectedly. Young artists wrote to him about moments when they chose grace over retaliation, courage over comfort, and self-respect over approval. They didn't ask him how to be famous. They asked him how to remain whole. Each message felt like proof that the impact of that night had outgrown the room where it began. Dean, too, felt the weight of time differently as the years passed. He remained effortless in public, still smiling easily, still brushing off praise. But privately he understood that his greatest contribution had never been his talent alone. It had been his willingness to stand beside someone when silence would have been safer. He never framed it as heroism. In his mind, it was simply friendship expressed honestly. But he came to accept that influence, when exercised with restraint, could shape cultures more effectively than force ever could. At a quiet industry tribute held long after the original incident had faded from public memory, both men were honored, not with grand speeches but with stories. People spoke of moments when they had felt seen, supported, respected, because someone else had modeled how to behave when power tempted cruelty. The room that night felt different from the one years before. There was less posturing, less performative charm, more listening. It wasn't perfect, but it was better, and that difference mattered. When Sammy took the microphone briefly, he didn't recount the insult or the response. He spoke instead about responsibility, the responsibility to treat others with humanity even when systems rewarded the opposite. He reminded the audience that silence could either enable harm or protect dignity, depending on how it was used. His words weren't heavy. They were calm, deliberate, and deeply grounded. Carrying the authority of lived experience rather than moral instruction, Dean spoke even less. He simply said that kindness wasn't weakness, that composure wasn't passivity, and that the strongest statements were often the ones made without anger. The room listened, not because he demanded attention, but because his life had already illustrated the truth of what he said. As the evening ended and people drifted away, the space felt lighter, not emptied, but fulfilled. There were no viral moments, no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices. Yet something enduring had been reaffirmed. That character revealed itself not in how loudly one spoke, but in how consistently one acted. Long after the lights dimmed and the chairs were stacked away, the lesson remained, carried forward quietly by those who had witnessed it and by those who learned of it later. It lived in decisions made backstage, in meetings where respect replaced dismissal, in moments where someone chose to stand beside another instead of looking away. And so the story did not end with applause or recognition. It ended where all meaningful stories do, in the invisible spaces where values take root and influence continues without needing acknowledgement. A director's insult had been forgotten. A calm response had not. What endured was the example that dignity does not need permission, that solidarity does not need spectacle, and that the most powerful voices are often the ones that never need to be raised.